Hello everyone, welcome to this one-off special DevOps chat where I'm delighted to have people from the core team that has developed a free and open source DevOps maturity assessment tool joining me to talk a little bit about how we put that tool together and what some of the benefits might be for teams using it ahead of the Twitter chat on this topic that we're going to have later this week. So perhaps very quickly, everyone could just introduce themselves. Chris, starting with you.
Well, I'm Chris Bainham-Hughes. I'm a business development manager for Red Hat Emerging Tech and also look at all the DevOps business development side of things.
Awesome. John?
Hi, I'm John Chatterton. I'm an enterprise architect at Atos in the kind of infrastructure architecture space.
And Dan?
I'm Dan Osher, head of digital self-service.
And Panos?
Hello, I'm Panos Panagiotis Tamtamis, working for Unify Atos Greece for about 12 years, and I'm a senior software engineer for developing a small PBX system for small and medium enterprises.
Awesome. So I think it's just over a year ago, we met each other through the Atos experts community, and we were thinking, what could we do to help teams everywhere improve along their own DevOps journey? And Chris, you came along and said, I've got this really simple idea. Do you want to tell us a bit about that conversation and what you were proposing and why?
Yeah, sure. So I guess there were a number of things eating at me at the time. So I was sort of frustrated with the one-dimensional conversation and views that we'd come up against when talking about DevOps. So I really wanted to communicate the sort of wider picture and essentially say it's not just about tooling. You know, automation and CI/CD pipeline are enablers of DevOps. They do not signal or show the kind of adoption of a DevOps culture per se. And it's really vital that we talk about that culture and process too. So the idea behind the assessment was really to sort of broaden out the discussion. And my experience has taught me that you don't generally do that through persuading people. You need to get them to draw their own conclusion. So the plan was really to ask questions on related areas rather than tell people about them and how they should be concerned about these areas. So ask them a number of questions and get them to sort of realize where they are or sort of see that the value and the input that can bring. And in that way, we can sort of generate and frame a discussion that's around sort of sharing the views and that would lead us to progress. And I have to say, sort of working with the team here was far, far better in terms of building the assessment than me doing it on my own. So, you know, collaboration is one of the fundamental tenets of DevOps, and the result of the assessment is far richer. You know, we challenged each other's perceptions, we shaped the questions that we had, and that was really the diverse views that we had were really important, and we could sort of certainly build a more powerful output and show that the we is much more powerful than the I, if you see what I mean. So thanks to you, David, for sort of bringing us all together, and thanks to everyone for that kind of the contribution sort of made in that. But I guess jumping back to the question, I'd sort of summarize it in saying we wanted to create something that anybody could engage with. It was principle-led and so was adaptive and not prescriptive. It communicated the breadth of DevOps, and it sort of shows that kind of one size doesn't fit all. So to try and sort of bust people out the mentality of I take these following steps, or there's some sort of silver bullet, or once I've got that, I'm DevOps, or something like that. So, you know, and the value really is an interpretation of the results, and that's done within the context of the environment within which the assessment has been made. And obviously people can do that themselves, or they can do that with a practitioner, or you could do it looking at somebody else's, you know, at a client that you're working with, sort of thing. So and then out of that, we could really provide that sort of suggested reading and the videos, etc., that would help in those key areas where they've scored the lowest, which should be sort of known pain points or known limiting factors to performance. So that was really what we were sort of trying to get at, I'll let people be the judges to whether we've achieved that.
And I think what's wonderful that you said there is that I remember you saying, oh, well, we need to do something concrete, we need to do something people can use. I've got some questions that, a starter for 10. But what happened, and this often happens, I think, in this kind of project, once you shared them, suddenly you realize how many different views there are, and how actually it is a really broad topic, and how do you categorize, the different aspects of DevOps. It turned out to be more challenging as a result of you sharing. And also we didn't just work in our group, but we also tried to get feedback from lots of other people and lots of other teams to feed into the tool, which I think it's been really helpful. But it's meant, for me at least, it's also been a real learning journey where,
yeah, sure,
I've definitely found out and discovered things, particularly around architecture, particularly around incentives, for example, where those are things that I hadn't fully considered before we started this work together.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely rich. So it's in a way, it's a harder path, right? Because a lot of us are sort of used to, just sort of taking our own path and doing that, relying on yourself, if you like. But it's a far richer path, and actually we got there, even though it sort of seemed to start a bit slower. We got there quicker in the end to actually what I think is really good, comprehensive starting point. And what we'd love to see, I guess, as well, is further collaborations going forward. Really, so it's it's on GitHub. Let's if people have something they want to input or suggest, focus, or let's let the contribution and the discussion.
Yeah. Let's keep it going. Yeah, absolutely.
You know what it's like. You can get get 100 DevOps, people working in the sort of DevOps culture or having views on DevOps, and they won't necessarily, they probably won't agree on, or in fact, they certainly won't agree on what DevOps is. There'll be a multitude of opinions, and I don't think we should be boiling the ocean, but we can get it into some sort of discrete areas that we can then have a discussion. And if you take that principle-led approach, you can really sort of drive out different interpretations of the delivery at the end. It's equally operating in it. It's just as validly working in a sort of a DevOps process, DevOps mode, if you like. Even though it's completely different from someone else who it, in turn is doing that as well. So it's that principle-led and adaptive to your environment and to what you're doing. I think that's really important.
Yeah. So I guess speaking then a little bit about the things that we've learned or the things we've discovered along the way, Dan, if I ask you about say the team agility section, where we're looking at kind of agile ways of working, what kind of insights or things did you discover as we went through this process of creating the assessment tool?
Yeah, well, I think for me, the key one is I probably fell into the trap of thinking DevOps was a very technical thing. I'd read a couple of books on it, which had sort of taught me otherwise, but going through this process with all of you, I realized there was a lot more to it than I originally thought. And actually, it's all about balance across several disciplines. So yeah, in terms of the agility, that plays a huge part in DevOps. I think we spent an awful lot more time, you mentioned it earlier, David, on sort of talking about incentives. And actually, for me, the key learning point was around how important it is for the team to have a kind of congruence, a kind of a alignment between the sort of the overall vision, the goals, the incentive structure, the way their work processes work. And actually, if you can get all of those things aligned, you've gone a long way towards DevOps. And you can then overlay some of the technical elements, which are the enablers, with alongside that. So for me, it was that congruence piece of bringing those elements together and that clarity from the very top all the way through.
And I love that. I think it is something that comes out that when I shared one of the early versions with a team, so just like you've said, oh, I thought DevOps was all about technology or tooling, but there's more to it than that. Someone else came back to me and said, oh, I hadn't realized automation was such a big part of DevOps. So again, I think it can expand people's horizons really for what is covered by that DevOps umbrella. John, I guess your passion and your kind of speciality is architecture. So again, I think it's one of the sections that we didn't even have at the start of the process, and then more and more as we went, we realized that architecture and design were quite key to a DevOps approach. So what jumped out at you from that side?
Yeah, I think the fact that the influence on architecture is so far-reaching, because you've got to change so much to make DevOps work, really. I mean, it's when you start seeing this kind of idea of we want to automated test on maybe a daily basis on a release. Well, that was science fiction 10 years ago, and people's architectures haven't traditionally been like that. And you can't just overlay that onto, you know, what you've been doing for the last 10 years. There is a very big sea change in architectures to accomplish DevOps and to enable that acceleration without burdening it without loads of kind of, you know, complicated manual process.
Yeah.
It's a very different world, I think.
I think also from what some of the things that you brought into it, it expanded my mind a bit in terms of, firstly, it's not just about putting things into the cloud. In fact, you could, if you take exactly what you've got now, architect it in the same way and put it in a cloud environment, doesn't necessarily help you release more frequently. But also that automation piece, it's how do you have an architecture that lets you test one component without having to have another component up and running? How do you have an architecture that lets you deploy one component without having to deploy all of the components at the same time? So it's quite far-reaching, isn't it? It's quite fundamental across all of the different parts.
Yeah, very much so. And, you know, people have been moving to these microservices and containerization and things that help enable this thing, but it's quite a big journey, I think, to go on to do that.
So go on.
Yeah, no, Karen, I was just, the other thing I noticed, I really enjoyed the process of this because it was kind of a development thing, really, and yet we didn't really, from an architectural perspective, do a DevOps thing. We haven't got dev, test, QA environments. We're not automated testing because we focused on the content. And I would imagine there's quite a lot of these kind of projects and activities that start with content. They don't start with architecture. So I think you have to understand that, almost have a framework of architecture that you can fit into as the project's going along, rather than day one, it has to be like this.
Yes, no, I completely agree. And then, Panos, I wanted to ask you something slightly different. Again, for the benefit of people viewing this, the first version was carefully crafted in Microsoft Excel and was really difficult to fill in, with people having to look in brackets at the end of answers how much they could score and then figure out whether they had to add them up or just pick one. But some teams agreed to kind of go through this first version and give us some feedback before we built the online tool. And you were one of the people who shared one of those early versions with your team. So could you tell us a little bit about what their reaction was and what came out of that?
Okay, of course, coming from a product that is already really matured, I participated to this team because I wanted to learn about the DevOps, and we wanted the whole team to become a more DevOpsy and to incorporate the new the tools that are coming into. So with the first runs, we ran the first runs with the team. Their response and their questions were really overwhelming, and of course it was for the whole team. The first draft, it was really an eye-opening experience because it was a really a conversation starter in order to understand what we needed to do and where we wanted to go, in order to start automate our procedures, in order to start making things and discuss things that were doing well and things that were not doing well, and of course implement new procedures and fix all the bad stuff that we had in the previous environment and start things from new in a product that is really mature.
And I guess, I mean, that relates back to what you were saying, Chris, almost right at the start, that, I mean, most people, and what you've just said, John, most people, they're not setting up a team to do DevOps from day one. Most people, they're in an existing team or in an existing organization. And that's where it's really helpful to figure out, where are you today? And actually, most people, I think, if they understand more about where they are today, they want to improve or they want to take some next steps. And that's much more powerful than say, instructing a team to start doing continuous integration or instructing a team to automate all their tests.
Yeah, I think that awareness actually is just being aware of it. You know, once you're aware of it, you can't help but see it everywhere, if you see what I mean. So once you kind of frame that discussion or frame that kind of conversation, start to look for, actually, yeah, we could improve on that by just doing this, and so you get into that kind of cadence of improvement and starting to do that. And I think that, as you say, it doesn't really matter where anybody's starting on this journey, whether they're right at the beginning and they want to use those principles to kind of move forward and sort of set things up right, or whether they're like most people, already in the mix and sort of trying to do that whilst also no doubt balancing an overwhelming inbox, right? So you know, so it allows that discussion to be had and filter through and percolate within the team, and then you can start to see the actions coming through. I think we should do this, or we should work on that, and you know, it's good.
Yeah. So I think I guess a reminder for everyone that it's free and open source with a very permissive license, so you can use it in any way you want. You can adapt it. As Chris said, we'd love to have feedback and suggestions for improvement, but you're under no obligation to share your changes with the wider community if you don't want to. And I think we at Atos, we've hosted it at DevOpsMaturity.atos.net. But again, we're hosting it in a way that we're not harvesting or collecting email addresses or information about your teams. You feel free to log on, try it, see what the results are. It is for your benefit. It's not for anyone else's. And then I guess the final thing to say, I suppose, is I'm looking forward to continuing this discussion in Twitter land for the DevOps chat later this week. So thanks everyone for joining in today, and we'll speak later this week.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.